The gift wrap slipped from my fingers as the phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Mom's photo smiled back at me, that carefully composed Christmas card portrait from 3 years ago, the one where I stood slightly behind everyone else, barely visible between Dad's shoulder and the mantle. Clara, honey, I hope you're sitting down. Eleanor's voice carried that particular tone she reserved for delivering disappointments wrapped in concern. I wasn't sitting, but I found myself sinking onto the couch anyway, my carefully chosen gifts scattered across the coffee table like evidence of my own foolishness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. We've been talking, she continued, and I could hear the rehearsed cadence, the way she'd practiced this conversation in the mirror, about Christmas this year, and we all think, it might be best if you took a break from the holidays. The room tilted slightly. Through the window, snow had started falling in fat, lazy flakes that would have looked magical any other evening. Tonight, they looked like static on a dying television screen. A break? I heard myself ask, though I already knew. I'd always known, somewhere deep in the part of me that had learned to expect disappointment like others expect sunrise. You know how intense things get when we're all together. The energy you bring from work, from the hospital, it's just heavy, sweetheart. We want peace this year. Ethan's been through so much with the gallery showing falling through, and he really needs a stress-free Christmas. Ethan. Of course. My golden-haired brother who'd failed upward his entire life while I held the scaffolding steady beneath him. The same Ethan whose rent I'd covered 6 months ago when his art wasn't selling, though he'd never mentioned it since. The brother who couldn't remember my birthday but expected me to fund his dreams. I've already requested the time off, I said, staring at my suitcase in the corner, already packed with the precision that defined every aspect of my life. Months ago. Oh, honey, we know, but maybe this is a sign that you need some you time. When's the last time you had a quiet Christmas? Just yourself, some wine, maybe one of those books you're always reading. The books I read alone, because no one in my family had ever asked what I was interested in beyond my usefulness as their invisible support system. And if I come anyway? The question escaped before I could stop it, though I already knew the answer from the slight pause that followed. Well, darling, we just can't have that kind of stress. If you show up, we may not be able to open the door. You understand, don't you? It's not personal. Not personal. As if 39 years of being the designated, responsible one, the problem solver, the financial safety net could be dismissed as impersonal. As if the careful gifts I'd wrapped, a first edition cookbook for Mom, the vintage camera strap Ethan had mentioned wanting, Dad's favorite whiskey that cost me half a day's wages, were just thoughtless gestures cluttering their perfect holiday tableau. Clara, are you still there? I'm here. My voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I'm always here. Good. We knew you'd understand. You always do. Maybe next year will be different. After she hung up, I sat surrounded by the debris of my expectations. The gifts looked suddenly pathetic, wrapped with corners hospital sharp and tagged in my careful handwriting. For Mom, who taught me to cook with love. For Ethan, because I know you'll create something beautiful. For Dad, who deserves the good stuff. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, and the weather app on my phone showed a massive storm system moving in. Historic lows, travel warnings, the kind of blizzard that made the evening news and left people stranded for days. I thought about my family's house, that drafty old Victorian they'd inherited from Grandma Rose, The same house where I'd spent countless weekends fixing what broke, updating what couldn't wait, quietly ensuring their comfort while remaining invisible as wallpaper. The house with the old furnace that wheezed through winters, the windows that never quite sealed right, the insulation I'd begged them to update but they deemed too expensive. The same house where, in October for the past 8 years, I'd quietly set up their emergency heating account. A little line item in my monthly budget they'd never noticed because I'd never told them. Why would I? They never asked how their heat stayed on when bills piled up, never wondered why their house stayed warm when the neighbors complained about frozen pipes. I was their scaffolding, essential but invisible, strong but unacknowledged. But scaffolding, I realized as I stared at the falling snow, wasn't meant to bleed. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not empty, but full of truths I'd spent years avoiding. I pulled out my laptop and opened the banking app, staring at the recurring payments that had become as automatic as breathing. The mortgage supplement that kept my parents from losing the house during Dad's rough patch 3 years ago. Ethan's emergency fund, carefully disguised as a gift card when his pride couldn't handle direct assistance. The property tax payment that ensured they never got those threatening letters from the county. And there, nestled between utilities and groceries, Whitmore Heating Emergency Account, $89.99 per month. Such a small number for such a large safety net. I'd started paying it after the winter Mom got pneumonia. She'd been too proud to admit they couldn't afford to keep the house properly heated, so she'd worn sweaters indoors and pretended it was cozy. I found her that February morning, wrapped in 3 blankets, lips faintly blue, too stubborn to call me for help. The emergency room doctor said another few hours and hypothermia might have set in. That night, I set up the account. Emergency heating service, priority repair, 24-hour support. The premium package that ensured no matter what happened, blown fuses, broken pipes, system failures, someone would come immediately to keep my family warm. 8 winters. Not once had they asked who paid for the miraculous speed with which repair technicians appeared at their door. Not once had they wondered why their elderly neighbors shivered through heating outages while their own home stayed toasty. In their minds, good things simply happened to them because they deserved good things. I scrolled through 8 years of charges, and the numbers blurred until I had to blink them back into focus. $8,639.20, nearly $9,000 I'd spent ensuring their comfort while living in a studio apartment with radiator heat and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. The memories came in fragments, sharp and cutting as the snow against my window. Christmas morning when I was 12, excitement bursting from me as I showed Mom the portrait I'd painted of our family. She'd glanced at it, distracted, and said, "That's nice, sweetie, but could you help me with the turkey?" Later, I found it in the recycling bin beneath coffee grounds and wrapping paper. When I asked her about it, she shrugged. I thought it was scrap paper from school. Maybe it was. To her. Maybe I was, too. High school graduation, where I'd finished valedictorian with a full scholarship to state. Dad had patted my shoulder and said, "Don't let all that studying make you forget how to have fun." The party lasted exactly as long as it took to eat cake, because Ethan had a soccer game that same afternoon. The living room was redecorated for his celebration before I'd even changed out of my cap and gown. But when Ethan dropped out of college the first time, then the second, then the third, each return was marked with welcome home banners and family dinners where his creative journey was toasted like an achievement. His bedroom walls were covered with framed participation certificates and most creative awards from elementary school. My medical school acceptance letter had been stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet advertising a pizza place, where it stayed for exactly 1 week before being replaced by Ethan's new girlfriend's Instagram photo. I thought about the night I called home after my first successful surgery, voice shaking with exhaustion and pride. I'd just spent 14 hours helping save a woman's life, and I wanted to share that moment with someone who loved me. Mom answered, But I could hear the television in the background, could hear her dividing her attention between me and some reality show. That's wonderful, honey. Oh, did I tell you? Ethan just got featured in that local arts magazine. We're so proud. Listen, can I call you back? This is a really good episode. She never called back. But when Ethan's rent was short, when Dad's business loan got called in, when Mom needed someone to coordinate her physical therapy appointments, I was always the first call, the reliable solution, the daughter who dropped everything and asked no questions. I remembered the night I realized I wasn't their daughter so much as their emergency contact. The realization had come slowly, like hypothermia, numbing me until I couldn't feel the cold anymore. In my apartment, surrounded by gifts they'd never receive and snow that promised to trap us all in our choices, I finally understood what I'd been to them. Not scaffolding. Scaffolding was appreciated, even if silently. Scaffolding was acknowledged as necessary. I was something else entirely. I was the foundation they'd forgotten they'd built their lives upon. And foundations, everyone knew, were supposed to be invisible and permanent. But foundations could crack, foundations could shift. And sometimes when the pressure became too much, foundations could choose to stop holding up the weight above them. The weather report crackled with the kind of urgency that made people clear grocery store shelves and drag out dusty generators. Historic winter storm approaching the tri-state area, record-breaking low temperatures expected with wind chills reaching -25 degrees. Residents are urged to ensure heating systems are functioning properly and to stock up on emergency supplies. I watched the meteorologist gesture at the massive white swirl covering half the continent, and something cold settled in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. This wasn't another winter storm. This was the kind of cold that killed people who weren't prepared, the kind of night when poorly insulated houses became traps instead of shelters. The kind of storm that would test every system, every backup plan, every safety net. My phone buzzed with the text from Ethan. Crazy storm coming. Good thing we've got the best heating system in town. Never had a single problem with it. Must be our good karma. Good karma. I stared at those words until they blurred, thinking of all the nights I'd lain awake during previous storms, checking and rechecking the emergency heating service app to make sure their house showed green across all systems. The nights I'd driven past their house after particularly bad weather just to see the warm glow in their windows and know they were safe. The app was still open on my laptop. One click would take me to the account management page. One more click would show me the cancellation option I'd never even looked at before tonight. The Whitmore house glowed like a magazine cover that Christmas Eve, every window warm with golden light against the swirling snow. Inside, Eleanor moved through her perfectly orchestrated holiday performance, straightening already straight garland and adjusting the angel on top of their 12-foot tree for the third time in an hour. "Doesn't it feel peaceful this year?" she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying that bright, artificial cheer she reserved for guests and difficult conversations. "So much calmer without all that hospital stress filling up the room." Thomas nodded from his recliner, nursing his second bourbon, and watching the storm through windows that rattled slightly in their frames. Clara always did bring the weight of the world home with her. All those sad stories from work. Death and dying. Who wants to hear about that on Christmas? Ethan emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of Eleanor's famous hot toddies, his smile as bright as the fairy lights wound around the banister. At 34, he still moved through their parents' house with the casual entitlement of the favored child, helping himself to the good scotch and leaving his wet boots wherever they landed. "To a drama-free Christmas," he announced, raising his mug in a toast. "To actually enjoying ourselves for once, instead of walking on eggshells around Miss Doom and Gloom." The assembled guests, a handful of family friends and Thomas's business associates, laughed politely. Eleanor beamed at her son, her golden boy who could always be counted on to lighten the mood. Clara chose to spend Christmas alone this year, Eleanor explained to Mrs. Patterson from next door, her voice carefully modulated to suggest both concern and relief. We're worried about her, of course. She's been so isolated lately. All work and no play. You know how it is. Mrs. Patterson made sympathetic noises while privately thinking that Clara had always seemed like the most grounded of the Whitmore children. But Eleanor was already moving on, steering the conversation toward Ethan's latest artistic endeavor, something involving reclaimed wood and mixed media that he'd been working on for 3 months without any visible progress. He's so creative, Eleanor gushed, refilling wine glasses with the expensive bottles Clara had given them last Christmas. Always seeing the world differently. That's the mark of a true artist, don't you think? The evening unfolded exactly as Eleanor had planned. Ethan entertained with stories of his gallery connections and future exhibitions. Thomas held court about market trends and investment opportunities. The conversation flowed around safe topics: travel plans, neighborhood gossip, and the charming difficulties of raising creative children. No one mentioned medical emergencies or patient care. No one talked about double shifts and life and death decisions. No one brought up the practical realities that undergirded their comfort. It was, Eleanor reflected with satisfaction, exactly the kind of Christmas she had always wanted. Light, joyful, uncomplicated by Clara's intensity. Around 10 o'clock, as the storm intensified outside, Thomas got up to adjust the thermostat. "Getting chilly in here," he muttered, turning the dial from 72 to 75. The old furnace in the basement groaned to life, a sound they'd all learned to ignore over the years. But tonight, the groaning seemed more labored than usual. The warm air that typically rushed from the vents felt weaker, more tentative. "Must be the storm," Eleanor said when Mrs. Patterson commented on the draft coming from the windows. "These old houses, full of character, but not much insulation." Ethan pulled his sweater tighter and moved closer to the fireplace, where a decorative gas insert provided more ambience than actual heat. "Good thing we've never had heating problems. This place stays warm as toast no matter what Mother Nature throws at us." By 11 o'clock, the first guests had begun making excuses about the weather and the roads. Mrs. Patterson gathered her coat, commenting that her own house would probably be an icebox by the time she got home. "These storms always knock out someone's heat. I just pray it's not mine." "We've been blessed," Thomas said, walking her to the door. "Never had a heating emergency in all the years we've lived here. Knock on wood." He rapped his knuckles against the doorframe as he spoke, a small superstition that had always made Clara roll her eyes. Tonight, there was no one to witness his faith in luck and good fortune. By midnight, only the immediate family remained. The house felt different now, larger somehow, as if the absence of guests had revealed how much space they actually occupied. Eleanor rustled around collecting glasses and plates, her Christmas dress swishing against furniture that seemed colder to the touch than it had hours ago. "Is it me, or is it getting chilly in here?" Ethan asked, rubbing his hands together. He was sprawled on the couch where Clara usually sat during family gatherings, the spot she'd claimed since childhood because it was closest to the heating vent. "The furnace is working overtime tonight," Thomas said, though he'd noticed the same thing. The reliable hum of warm air from the vents had become more sporadic, less consistent. "Old system, big storm, it's probably just struggling a bit." Eleanor frowned as she passed the thermostat. 75 degrees, just as Thomas had said it. But the reading seemed wrong somehow. The air felt more like 68, maybe 65. She turned the dial up to 78, then 80. The furnace responded with a wheeze that sounded almost human, almost desperate. "Maybe we should call someone," Eleanor suggested, though even as she said it, she knew how ridiculous it sounded. Who would come out on Christmas Eve in the middle of a blizzard? "Call who?" Ethan laughed. "It's midnight on Christmas Eve. Besides, it's probably just the storm affecting the system. These things happen." But these things had never happened to them. In all their years in the house, through every storm and cold snap, their heat had been as reliable as sunrise. They'd grown accustomed to being the house on the block that stayed warm, the family that never worried about frozen pipes or emergency repair bills. They'd grown accustomed to being taken care of by forces they'd never questioned. As the clock struck 12:30, officially making it Christmas Day, the Whitmore family sat in their increasingly cold living room, still believing that morning would bring warmth and solutions, still believing that good things happen to good people, and that they were very good people indeed. Outside, the storm raged on and the temperature continued to drop. The house exhaled its warmth in degrees, so gradually at first that the Whitmores convinced themselves it was just their imagination. Eleanor wrapped herself in the cashmere throw from the back of the sofa, a gift Clara had brought her 2 Christmases ago, and tried to focus on the pleasant crackle of the decorative fireplace. But by 2 in the morning, there was no pretending anymore. "Jesus Christ, it's freezing in here," Ethan announced, his breath visible in small puffs as he spoke. He'd pulled on 2 sweaters and was now eyeing his father's winter coat hanging by the front door. Thomas had given up any pretense of Christmas cheer and was crouched beside the ancient radiator in the living room, pressing his ear against the metal like a doctor listening for a heartbeat. The radiator was barely warm, producing only the faintest trickle of heat that dissipated into the growing cold. "The furnace is running," though his voice carried none of its usual confidence. "I can hear it down there, working away, but something's not right." Eleanor had moved beyond denial into the kind of manic problem-solving that overtook her during crisis. She dragged every blanket from the linen closet into the living room and was now layering them over the furniture like she was building a fort. "We'll camp here tonight," she announced, her breath forming clouds in the 40-degree air. "Right by the fireplace. It'll be like an adventure. Remember when you boys were little and you'd build blanket forts?" But neither Thomas nor Ethan was buying into her forced optimism. The decorative fireplace, they were discovering, was designed for ambience, not survival. Its fake logs and controlled flame provided about as much heat as a large candle. "This is insane," Ethan muttered, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling someone. There has to be an emergency service or something." He scrolled through search results with fingers that were starting to stiffen from cold. "Here. 24-hour emergency heating repair. Says it serves our area." The phone rang 6 times before connecting to an automated system. "Thank you for calling Premium Emergency Heating Services. If this is a true emergency, please press 1. If you'd like to set up a service account, please press 2. If you're an existing customer, please press 3. Ethan pressed 1 and waited, the phone cold against his ear. "We're sorry, but the number you've reached shows no active service account for your address. Emergency priority service is only available to premium account holders. For standard emergency service, please expect a wait time of 12 to 18 hours due to high demand during severe weather conditions." 12 to 18 hours? Ethan's voice cracked. "Lady, it's below 0 in my house. We could die by then." "I understand your concern, sir. For immediate emergency service, I can set up a premium account for you right now. The activation fee is $850, plus the emergency call fee of $400, plus labor and parts. Would you like me to process that?" Ethan looked around the living room at his parents, bundled in blankets like refugees. $1,200 just to get someone to look at their furnace? That's ridiculous. This is an emergency. "Yes, sir. Emergency service is a premium offering. Would you like me to proceed with account setup?"
"How is this possible?" Eleanor asked, her voice smaller now, more frightened. "We've never had problems before. The heat just always worked." Thomas was standing by the front window, watching their neighbors' houses. The Andersons' place next door was completely dark. The Johnsons' across the street had only one light on upstairs. But most of the houses showed the warm glow of occupied rooms, families sleeping safely in heated bedrooms. "Everyone else seems fine," he said. "It's just us." That's when Ethan's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and his face went white. "It's the heating company, the one I just called," he answered with shaking fingers. Hello? Mr. Whitmore? This is Premium Emergency Heating Services calling back. I wanted to let you know that we do show a service history for your address. There was an active premium account under that address until... There was a pause, the sound of keyboard clicking. Until 11:59 p.m. last night. The account was canceled by the primary account holder. The room went silent, except for the howling wind outside. Canceled? Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Who was the account holder? More keyboard sounds. I'm not at liberty to share personal information, but I can tell you the account had been active for 8 years and was set to automatic renewal. The cancellation was processed manually yesterday evening. Ethan lowered the phone and looked at his parents. In the dim light of the decorative fireplace, their faces looked older, more fragile than he'd ever seen them. Clara, Eleanor whispered. Clara had a heating account for us. The realization hit them like a physical blow. For 8 years, while they'd congratulated themselves on their reliable heating system, while they'd bragged about never having problems, while they'd assumed their comfort was a result of good luck or superior house maintenance, Clara had been paying for emergency heating service. Clara, who worked double shifts at the hospital, Clara, who lived in a studio apartment and drove a car with 200,000 miles on it, Clara, who they'd just banned from Christmas for being too serious, too heavy, too much of a burden on their holiday joy. She's trying to kill us, Ethan said, his voice rising to a near hysteria. She's actually trying to kill us. Don't be dramatic, Thomas snapped, though his own voice shook. She's making a point. A point? Ethan stood up so fast that blankets fell to the floor. Dad, it's Christmas morning and it's 40 degrees in our house. She cut off our heat during a blizzard. This isn't making a point. This is attempted murder. Eleanor was crying now, quiet tears that froze on her cheeks before they could fall. Why didn't she tell us? Why didn't we know? But even as she asked, she knew the answer. They hadn't known because they'd never wanted to know. They'd never asked who paid for the repairs that happened so quickly, never wondered why their house stayed warm when others struggled. They'd trained themselves not to see Clara's sacrifices, because seeing them would have meant acknowledging them, and acknowledging them would have meant gratitude, and gratitude was harder than taking. The house continued to grow colder. By morning, the pipes would start to freeze. By noon, if nothing changed, the house would be uninhabitable. And somewhere across town, Clara was spending her first Christmas in years without worrying about whether they were warm enough. My apartment was cold too, but it was a different kind of cold. Clean, honest, the kind of cold that didn't come with betrayal or bitter realizations. I'd unplugged the Christmas tree after the phone call, letting the colored lights die one by one until only the glow from the street lamp outside provided any illumination. The carefully wrapped gifts sat in the corner like monuments to my own foolishness, but I found I could look at them now without the sharp ache of rejection. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. I made tea in my tiny kitchen. The kettles whistled the only sound besides the storm rattling my windows. This building was old too, built in the same era as my family's house, but I'd never expected it to be more than adequate. I'd learned to layer clothes and drink hot beverages and appreciate the simple comfort of being warm enough. I'd learned to take care of myself because I'd never had any other choice. As I settled onto my couch with my mug, wrapped in the wool blanket I'd bought myself last winter, I realized this was the first Christmas Eve in 8 years that I wasn't checking my phone every few minutes, wasn't monitoring the emergency heating app to make sure their system was running properly. Wasn't lying awake wondering if the old furnace would make it through another storm. For the first time in nearly a decade, someone else's survival wasn't my responsibility. The relief was so overwhelming, it felt like grief. I thought about them now, probably noticing the cold just beginning to creep in, probably assuming it was just the storm, just the old house settling, just a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself by morning. They were so accustomed to problems solving themselves, to comfort arriving without effort, that it might take hours for them to understand what was really happening. Part of me, the part that had spent 39 years being their foundation, wanted to call them, wanted to warn them about the canceled account, maybe even reinstate it before things got dangerous. The part of me that had been trained to prioritize their comfort over my own dignity whispered that this had gone far enough, that I'd made my point. But I'd tried making points before. I'd tried subtle hints about appreciation, gentle suggestions about balance, quiet requests for recognition. None of it had worked, because they'd never wanted to see me as anything other than the infrastructure of their lives. Infrastructure didn't get thanked. Infrastructure didn't get invited to Christmas. Infrastructure just existed, silent and reliable, until it didn't. I sipped my tea and watched the snow fall past my window. The building's radiator clanked and hissed, providing just enough heat to keep me comfortable. Not luxurious, not effortless, but enough. It occurred to me that I'd spent so many years ensuring my family never had to experience enough. They'd always had abundance, excess, the kind of comfort that allowed them to take comfort for granted. But tonight, alone in my small apartment with my simple heat and my honest cold, I finally understood the difference between enough and too much. Enough was sustainable. Enough was earned. Enough was something you could appreciate because you knew what it felt like to do without. Too much made you soft. Too much made you cruel. Too much made you forget that someone was paying for your comfort, even when that someone was invisible. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from Aunt Margaret. "How are you holding up, sweetheart? I keep thinking about what Eleanor said to you." Margaret. Mom's older sister, the one who'd never married, never had children, never learned how to make herself small for the comfort of others. The family called her difficult, but I'd always suspected she was just honest about things the rest of us were trained to ignore. I typed back, "I'm okay. Really okay, actually." She responded immediately, "Good. You've carried them long enough. Sometimes love means letting people feel the consequences of their choices." The consequences of their choices. Not my cruelty, not my revenge, not my instability, their choices. The choice to take without giving. The choice to exclude without considering. The choice to build their comfort on someone else's sacrifice without ever acknowledging the foundation. Another message from Margaret. "Eleanor called me an hour ago, said the house is getting cold and they can't figure out why. Asked if I knew anything about heating repair companies." A pause. Then, "I told her I didn't know anything about that, but maybe she should call Clara, since Clara always seems to know how to fix things." I smiled for the first time all day. Margaret had always been the family truth teller, the one who said what everyone else was thinking but too polite to voice. What did she say? "She hung up on me, but she'll call you eventually. They all will. Be ready." I set the phone aside and pulled my blanket tighter. Tomorrow they would call, probably desperate by then, probably angry. They would demand explanations and make accusations. They would frame my withdrawal as cruelty and their suffering as my fault. But tonight, I was just a woman in a warm enough apartment, drinking tea and watching snow fall outside her window. Tonight, I wasn't responsible for anyone's comfort but my own. And for the first time in years, that felt like exactly enough. Margaret's call came at 8:30 Christmas morning, and I could hear the barely contained laughter in her voice before she even spoke. "Well, honey, you've certainly stirred the pot." I was still in my pajamas, sitting by the window with my second cup of coffee, watching the snow continue to fall. The storm had raged all night, leaving the world outside transformed into something pristine and unforgiving, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. "How bad is it?" I asked, though part of me already knew from the tone of her voice. "Oh, it's spectacular." Margaret had never been one to soften difficult truths. "I just got off the phone with your mother. Well, she hung up on me again, but not before I got the full story. Apparently, their house hit 38 degrees around dawn. The pipes in the guest bathroom froze around 6. Eleanor has been calling every heating company in the county, but nobody's available until tomorrow at the earliest. Emergency rates starting at $1,500. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. Outside, a neighbor was attempting to shovel his driveway, his movements slow and labored against the continuing snowfall.
Your brother's been posting on social media, Margaret continued. Very dramatic stuff about family betrayal and people who take revenge during emergencies. He seems to think you're some kind of criminal mastermind. And what do you think? Margaret was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. I think you spent 8 years keeping them warm without them ever saying thank you. I think they threw you away like yesterday's newspaper the moment you became inconvenient. And I think sometimes the only way to show people what they've lost is to let them live without it. She paused, and I could hear her lighting one of her cigarettes. Margaret had never quit, claiming that life was too short to give up all your vices for people who'd outlive you anyway. Your brothers keep saying she doesn't understand why you didn't tell them about the heating account. She seems genuinely bewildered that you'd pay for something without making sure they knew about it. Of course she doesn't understand. I watched a family across the street building a snowman in their front yard, their children bundled in bright winter coats, their laughter carrying across the muffled silence. She's never done anything for anyone without expecting recognition. That's exactly what I told her. I said, Eleanor, when's the last time you did something for someone without making sure they knew about it? She didn't have an answer for that. Margaret took a long drag of her cigarette. She also seems to think this is all some kind of breakdown. Keeps talking about how you've been acting strange lately, how the stress of your job must be getting to you. She's already called your Aunt Linda to discuss staging some kind of intervention. An intervention? For your own good, of course, because clearly the problem isn't that they took you for granted for decades. The problem is that you've become unstable and vindictive. I found myself laughing, a sound that surprised me with its lightness. Let me guess. They want to get me help. Oh, honey, they've already decided you need help. Eleanor spent 20 minutes on the phone with Linda discussing how to reach you before you do something even more dangerous. Apparently, cutting off their heat during a blizzard is just the tip of the iceberg. Who knows what you might do next? The absurdity of it was almost beautiful. After 39 years of being their solution to every problem, I had become their problem. The responsible daughter who had never caused them a moment's worry was suddenly the dangerous one, the unstable one, the one who needed managing. They're scared, Clara, Margaret said, her voice gentle now. Genuinely scared, not just from the cold, but from what it means that you're not there to fix it. They're realizing how much they depend on you, and instead of being grateful, they're angry. It's easier to be angry than ashamed. I understood that. Anger was clean, simple. Anger let you be the victim. Shame required looking at yourself honestly, and the Whitmores had never been much for honest self-reflection. Eleanor asked me if you thought they'd come back if they apologized. I told her I didn't know, but that if they were planning to apologize, she might want to think about what she was apologizing for first. What'd she say? She said she didn't know what I meant, said she'd already apologized for hurting your feelings about Christmas, but that you were taking it too far. Margaret's voice carried the particular exhaustion that came from trying to explain empathy to people who'd never learned the language. I told her that wasn't the same thing as apologizing for 39 years of taking you for granted. Through my window, I watched the family across the street finish their snowman. The father lifted the smallest child onto his shoulders so she could place the carrot nose, and their joy was so uncomplicated, so pure, that it made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. They'll come to you, Margaret said. Probably today, once they get desperate enough. Eleanor's pride won't let her freeze to death, and Thomas is already talking about driving over there to talk sense into you. Let them come. Good girl. I could hear the smile in her voice. You know, I've been waiting 30 years for someone in this family to stand up to them. I always hoped it would be you. Why me? Because you're the only one who ever saw them clearly. The rest of us either enable them or avoid them, but you kept showing up, kept taking care of them, even when you knew exactly what they were. That takes a special kind of strength, honey, the kind of strength that can also say no when it needs to. After we hung up, I sat in the growing morning light and thought about strength. For so long, I'd thought strength meant endurance.
the ability to carry weight without breaking, to absorb damage without complaint, to keep functioning no matter what was asked of me.
But Margaret was right. Real strength wasn't about how much you could carry. Real strength was knowing when to put the weight down. My phone buzzed with notifications, texts from cousins I hadn't heard from in months, all with variations of the same message. "Are you okay? We heard about the family situation. Mom said there was some kind of emergency." The narrative was already spreading through the extended family network, and I could guess how it was being framed. Poor Clara, having some kind of breakdown. Poor Eleanor and Thomas, victims of their unstable daughter's revenge plot. But for once, I didn't feel the familiar urge to correct the story, to defend myself, to make sure everyone understood my side. The people who mattered, Margaret, and maybe a few others, already understood. The people who didn't matter would believe whatever made them comfortable. And I was done making other people comfortable at my own expense. They arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, looking like refugees from their own privilege. Eleanor wore her good winter coat, but I could see at least 3 layers underneath it. Thomas had dark circles under his eyes and the grim expression of a man whose comfortable world had tilted off its axis. Ethan brought up the rear, his face flushed with cold and righteous anger. I watched them through my window as they climbed the steps to my building, their movements careful on the ice-covered concrete. They huddled together while Eleanor pressed my buzzer, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The intercom crackled to life. "Clara? Sweetheart, it's Mom. We need to talk." I looked at the 3 small figures on the security monitor, bundled against the cold they'd never had to truly fear before. For a moment, I felt the old familiar tug of responsibility, the ingrained need to fix their discomfort. But then I remembered the rehearsed speech about my heavy energy, the casual dismissal of 39 years of devotion. "What do you want?" I asked through the intercom. "Just to talk, honey. Can we come up? It's freezing out here." "I know." The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Eleanor's voice came again, smaller now, less certain. "Clara, we need to discuss the situation. Whatever's wrong, we can work it out." I buzzed them in, not because I wanted to make them comfortable, but because the conversation needed to happen. When they reached my door, I opened it just wide enough to see their faces clearly, but I didn't step aside to let them enter. "Well," I said. Thomas cleared his throat, taking on the role of family negotiator. "Clara, we know you're upset about Christmas. We understand why you might be hurt by our decision." "Do you?" "Of course we do. And we want you to know that we're willing to discuss including you in future celebrations. But this," he gestured vaguely, as if my apartment building somehow represented my betrayal. "This is dangerous, Clara. You could have killed us." Ethan pushed forward, his anger less controlled than his father's diplomatic approach. "You cut off our heat during a blizzard. Our pipes froze. Mom's been wrapped in blankets all day. What kind of person does that to their own family?" I studied his face. This brother I'd protected and enabled for decades. His indignation was so pure, so uncomplicated by self-awareness that it was almost impressive. "The kind of person who's been paying for your heat for 8 years without you noticing or caring," I said quietly. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point." I kept my voice level, calm. "You banned me for Christmas because my energy was too heavy, because I brought stress into your perfect holiday. But you never wondered where your comfort came from, did you? You never asked who made sure your house stayed warm when everyone else's was freezing?" The hallway went quiet, except for the distant sound of someone's television and the building's ancient heating system rattling through the walls. "We appreciate everything you've done," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Better ways." I repeated the words slowly, tasting their absurdity. Like what? Like continuing to be your invisible support system while you exclude me from the family I've spent my life supporting?
We never excluded you, Eleanor protested. We just thought you thought I was too much trouble for Christmas, too serious, too heavy, too likely to ruin your perfect holiday mood. I stepped slightly forward, still blocking the doorway. So you decided I wasn't worth including, but somehow you still expected me to keep paying for your comfort. Ethan's face flushed darker. Nobody asked you to pay for anything. That was your choice. You're right. It was my choice. And now I'm making a different choice. So you're just gonna let us freeze? His voice cracked with disbelief. You're gonna let Mom and Dad suffer because your feelings got hurt? The word choice was interesting. Hurt. As if 39 years of being taken for granted was just hurt feelings, a temporary emotional state that would pass if I could just be reasonable. I'm not letting you do anything, I said. I'm just not preventing it anymore. There's a difference. Eleanor was crying now, quiet tears that she probably hoped would move me. Clara, please, we're your family. We love you. No, I said, and the word felt clean and sharp in the cold air. You love what I do for you. You love having a daughter who solves your problems and asks for nothing in return. But you don't love me enough to include me in Christmas. You don't love me enough to notice what I sacrifice. You don't love me enough to say thank you. Thomas tried one more diplomatic approach. What do you want from us, Clara? Tell us what it would take to fix this. I looked at the three of them, bundled in their emergency clothes, their faces pinched with cold and desperate with the kind of fear that came from losing something they'd never realized they had. What did I want? For them to appreciate me? To grovel? To promise they'd never take me for granted again? But I realized I didn't want any of those things anymore. You couldn't force someone to value you. You couldn't make them see your worth through suffering or ultimatums or even through withdrawal. You could only choose to stop giving your worth to people who refused to see it. I don't want anything from you, I said, and meant it. I'm done wanting things from you. And I closed the door. By evening, my phone was buzzing with texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. The family phone tree was in full operation, spreading Eleanor's carefully crafted version of events like a virus through our extended network. Cousin Beth from Oregon. Heard you're going through a tough time. Depression can really affect judgment. Let me know if you need someone to talk to. Uncle Paul from Michigan. Your parents are worried sick. Whatever happened, family should stick together. Call your mother. Aunt Linda from the next town over. Eleanor says you're having some kind of breakdown. I have a friend who's a therapist if you need a referral. Each message carried the same underlying assumption. I was the problem. I was unstable, unreasonable, dangerous. Poor Eleanor and Thomas, victims of their daughter's inexplicable cruelty. Poor Ethan, suffering because his sister had finally snapped. The narrative was as predictable as it was false. But what surprised me was how little I cared about correcting it. I scrolled through social media and found Ethan's posts from throughout the day, each one a carefully crafted plea for sympathy. When family turns against you during the holidays, it makes you realize who your real support system is. Grateful for friends who show up when blood relatives don't. Some people think cutting others off is the same as setting boundaries. There's a difference between protecting yourself and trying to hurt people who love you. Spending Christmas in a cold house because someone decided revenge was more important than family. But we'll get through this together, like we always do. The responses were exactly what he'd been fishing for. Heart emojis and supportive comments from friends who knew nothing about the situation except what Ethan chose to share. Family can be so toxic. You deserve better. Cut negative people out of your life, even if they're relatives. I could have responded, could have shared my side of the story, explained about the 8 years of secret payments, the decades of being taken for granted, could have shown screenshots of my bank statements, provided evidence of every bill I quietly covered while they praised each other's generosity. But I didn't. The people commenting on Ethan's posts didn't know me. They'd never shown interest in my life, never asked about my struggles, never offered support during my difficult times. Why should I care what they thought about this situation?
The extended family members texting me with concern and advice? Where had they been when I was working double shifts and sending money home? When had any of them checked on me, offered help, noticed that I might need support? Their sudden interest in my well-being was directly proportional to the drama I'd created. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the disruption to their comfortable narrative about family dynamics. Margaret was right. It was easier for everyone if I was the problem. If I was unstable, having a breakdown, acting out of character, then the situation was fixable. Get Clara some help, talk her down from her unreasonable position, restore the status quo where she quietly enabled everyone else's comfort. But if I wasn't crazy, if I was simply done being invisible, then they'd have to examine their own behavior. They'd have to ask uncomfortable questions about who they'd been taking for granted, what support systems they'd failed to notice, which family members they'd treated as disposable. Around 10 o'clock, I received a group text that had been sent to at least 15 people, all the cousins and aunts and uncles who'd been messaging me individually. It was from Eleanor. I want everyone to know that we're deeply concerned about Clara's mental health. She's been under tremendous stress at work, and we think that stress has affected her judgment. We're exploring options for getting her the help she needs. In the meantime, we ask for your patience and understanding as we navigate this difficult situation as a family. I read it twice, then set my phone aside. She was good. I had to give her that. Concerned, but not accusatory. Loving, but worried. The kind of message that made her look like the caring mother, dealing with a troubled child, rather than the woman who'd banned her daughter from Christmas for being inconvenient. My phone buzzed again. A private message from cousin Sarah, one of the few relatives I'd actually liked growing up. Clara, I don't know what's really going on, but that group text from your mom feels like bullshit to me. Are you okay? Do you need anything? I stared at the message for a long time, surprised by the relief I felt. One person. Out of all the relatives who'd received Eleanor's manipulation, one person had seen through it enough to ask for my side. I typed back, "I'm better than I've been in years. Thank you for asking." She responded immediately, "Good. I always thought your family took you for granted. Wasn't sure if you saw it too." I see it now. About damn time. I smiled and turned off my phone. Let them run their smear campaign. Let them paint me as unstable and vindictive. Let them comfort each other with stories about my breakdown and their victimhood. The truth was simpler and more threatening than any of their narratives. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't having a breakdown. I wasn't lashing out in some temporary fit of anger. I was just done. And unlike their carefully constructed stories about my instability, being done was permanent. 3 weeks later, the snow had melted into dirty slush, and the emergency of Christmas had faded into memory. The heating crisis had been resolved. They had eventually paid the emergency fees and found a company willing to restore their service, though not without considerable expense and discomfort. Life had returned to what they probably thought of as normal. But I had changed, and change, I was learning, was irreversible. I was sitting in my apartment on a quiet Sunday morning reading a novel I'd bought for myself instead of carefully selecting gifts for people who wouldn't appreciate them, when the envelope arrived. Slipped under my door sometime during the night, my name written in Eleanor's careful cursive across cream-colored paper. Inside was a card, not a greeting card, but expensive stationery with our family monogram embossed in gold. The kind of paper Eleanor used for important correspondence, for thank you notes to her bridge club friends and condolence letters to distant acquaintances. "Dear Clara," it began, and I could practically hear her voice in the formal phrasing. "We hope you've had time to reflect on the events of Christmas and can see how things got out of hand. While we understand you were upset about our holiday plans, we think we've all learned valuable lessons about communication and family expectations." I paused, already recognizing the tone. This wasn't an apology, it was a negotiation disguised as reconciliation. "We've discussed it as a family, and we're prepared to include you in future holiday celebrations, provided we can all agree to move forward in a more positive direction. We think it would be beneficial for everyone if we could return to the way things were before this unfortunate misunderstanding. The way things were. Back to invisible Clara, reliable Clara, useful Clara who solved problems and asked no questions and never, ever disrupted the comfortable dynamics that served everyone but her. We're also hoping you might consider resuming some of the financial arrangements that were inadvertently disrupted during this difficult time. Thomas's car insurance lapsed, and we've had some unexpected expenses with the heating situation. We know you care about our well-being and wouldn't want us to struggle unnecessarily. There it was. The real reason for the letter. Not remorse, not genuine reconciliation, but a request for me to resume my role as their invisible support system. They were willing to let me back into Christmas, generously allowing me to buy them gifts and cook their food and clean their dishes, as long as I also went back to funding their comfort. We love you and miss you, and we hope you'll consider this olive branch in the spirit it's intended. Family is the most important thing, and we've always been able to work through our differences before. The letter was signed by all three of them, though I could tell Eleanor had written it. Thomas's signature was his usual illegible scrawl, Ethan's was deliberately stylized to look artistic, and Eleanor's was perfectly formed, just like everything else she presented to the world. I read it twice, then set it aside and made coffee. Through my window, I watched people walking their dogs and couples heading out for Sunday brunch, all the small rituals of normal life continuing, while my family waited for my response to their carefully crafted manipulation. But there would be no response. Not because I was angry anymore. Anger had been replaced by something calmer and more permanent. Not because I wanted to punish them, though I understood they would see it that way, but because you couldn't go back to being invisible once you'd learned what it felt like to be whole. Later that morning, another letter arrived, this one express delivery from across the country. Margaret's handwriting was as bold and unapologetic as she was. Dearest Clara, I heard through the grapevine that Eleanor is trying to lure you back into the family fold. I hope you're too smart to fall for it. You've done something most people never manage. You've broken free from a system that was slowly killing you. Don't let them convince you to climb back into that cage. She'd enclosed a clipping from a magazine article about family dynamics and emotional labor, with certain passages highlighted in yellow. The invisible work of maintaining family harmony often falls disproportionately on one person, usually a woman, who becomes the emotional and practical caretaker for everyone else's comfort. This person's own needs become secondary to the family stability, creating a dynamic that is both unsustainable and unacknowledged. In the margins, Margaret had written, "Sound familiar?" Her letter continued, "I've been the family black sheep for 68 years, and I can tell you that the view is much better from out here. You can see clearly when you're not constantly focused on keeping everyone else comfortable. You can breathe when you're not holding your breath, waiting for the next crisis to solve." At the bottom, she'd added, "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. It takes courage to choose yourself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. Don't let them talk you out of it." I folded Margaret's letter carefully and placed it in the frame that had held my college graduation photo, the one my family had recycled without asking. Margaret's words looked good there, surrounded by the simple black frame I'd bought myself. Over the following days, there were more attempts at contact. Eleanor called twice, leaving voicemails that grew progressively less diplomatic. Ethan sent a series of texts that ranged from pleading to accusatory to threatening. Thomas, true to form, remained silent, but somehow managed to convey his disappointment through his absence. I deleted the voicemails without listening to them fully. I read Ethan's texts long enough to recognize their patterns, then blocked his number. I changed my emergency contact at work from Thomas Whitmore, father, to Margaret Chen, aunt. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a lightness I hadn't felt since childhood. I started taking evening walks around my neighborhood, noticing flowers I'd never seen before and restaurants I'd never had time to try. I signed up for a pottery class on Saturday mornings, the time I used to spend running errands for other people's emergencies. I bought myself flowers every Friday, not expensive arrangements, just grocery store bouquets that made my small apartment feel intentional rather than simply adequate. I cooked meals I actually wanted to eat instead of practicing recipes for family dinners where my contributions went unnoticed. Most surprisingly, I discovered that I enjoyed my own company. Without the constant background noise of other people's needs and crises, I could hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time in decades. 6 months after Christmas, I received one final letter. This one came through my work address, suggesting they'd done some research to track me down. It was from Ethan, and it was different from his previous communications, less angry, more desperate.
Clara, I know you're still mad, but this has gone on long enough. Mom's been having health problems, and the stress of this family situation isn't helping. Dad's business is struggling, and some of the bills are getting hard to manage. We need you to be the bigger person here and help us figure out how to move forward as a family.